Are you unsure about which state law might apply to your employment situation? Here at Reiki and Wolf, we can help. If you work in one state and live in another, which state law applies to you? That's actually not the easiest question to answer in different circumstances. So courts and lawyers look at what's called the most substantial relationship test, and there are a number of different factors involved. And so it's not just where you live and where you work, although those are important factors, but also where the employer works, where it has its business operations, who you report to and where they live and work, as well as how much work do you do outside of your resident state. And finally, you would look at the employment agreement to see if there is a provision in there about which state law applies. That could have some impact on it as well. And so, like I said, it's not an easy question to answer, and that's why it's probably important to contact an attorney if you have a question about that.
Does it make a difference if my employer took out Washington state taxes or unemployment?
Yeah, it sure does. Generally, you would look at your pay stub to see how they treat you in terms of your taxes. Again, this isn't dispositive, but it certainly impacts the analysis. How are remote workers impacted by state laws? You have to look at a number of different factors. Certainly, where you work is important, but also where is the employer and where did the employment relationship start? If you move somewhere during the employment relationship, that's a factor as well. You would also want to look at the employment agreement to see if it stipulates where they want, meaning the employer, where they want the action to be heard and what state law applies. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to follow that. So as a remote worker, you certainly have rights, but it's important to determine which state's law applies.
Rick, if I'm working here in Washington and I was hired in Washington, I've never left the state. Would it be Washington law applies or the state of my employer?
Yeah, so Washington law is pretty aggressive in terms of protecting its residents and employees who work here and live here. And so in most circumstances, Washington law will apply. But again, a lawyer would need to look through everything and make sure that that's the case. For example, in some situations, an agreement might say, hey, California law applies. And in that case, you'd want to look into a number of other factors too.
And if an agreement says the California law applies, then am I out of luck?
No. There's a decent chance that Washington law could still apply, but you would just need to be very careful because if you do file in the wrong state and you don't have a really good reason to file in Washington state based upon information that generally lawyers would know, then the employer could recover fees against you. So it's important to talk to a lawyer to try to figure this out. When is an employee Washington-based? Well, courts have analyzed this, and for most intents and purposes, Washington-based employees are certainly employees who live and work in Washington. Sometimes a Washington-based employee is somebody who actually just lives in Washington. Sometimes it's an employee who just works in Washington, but maybe lives in Idaho or Oregon. So it really depends on a number of factors. You could look at your pay stub and see what taxes are being taken out. But again, that's not going to tell you everything. So you would really need to call an attorney, or Washington Labor and Industries might be able to help as well. But certainly an attorney should be able to provide you guidance on understanding if you indeed are a Washington-based employee. Is there any conflict between state laws? The answer, as with many things, is sometimes Washington law frequently is going to be more employee-friendly than other states. So, for example, Florida, let's say, is going to have generally more employer-friendly provisions in terms of their law. And so if you are living and working in Washington, but work for a Florida company, you probably would want to see if Washington law could apply if you have a dispute with that employer and would want to, be protected by Washington law as opposed to Florida law. And so obviously there are a lot of states. And so it's important to try to talk to somebody who knows about this to determine which state law would apply to you.